Well, we're coming and welcome then to lecture number 19, which is the first of two parts on parenting in a digital age. You'll see right away that there are a lot of slides in this presentation, and a lot of it has some fairly straightforward information on it, a little bit of history, statistics, and that kind of thing, which is, because it's straightforward, I probably won't spend a lot of time on that. I will say in advance that if you were to ever do a presentation on this kind of material, I would greatly suggest that you update the information and not just rely on what I have for you here. I am giving you the most recent information that I have, and as a matter of fact, for this class, I spent some time updating the information from what resources I could find. That's why this particular lecture I pushed off until the end, so I'd have time to be able to do that. But these are the kinds of trends that change fairly rapidly. New technology gets introduced, new apps get introduced. Some things that used to be popular aren't popular anymore, and other things that weren't popular have a meteoric rise in popularity. So you need to keep track of this and get the most recent information you can. I'll give you some suggestions with respect to that. I think this information is important because I will mention a little bit later the generational difference between the adult generation that was born before much of this digital explosion happened. We live in a different world now. And for the young people who are coming up in our families and in our churches who have taken all of this for granted, practically born with a screen in their hand, the world is quite different, and the two generations don't always see the world in the same way. I gave a presentation on material very similar to what I am giving to you in this lecture to a group of Chinese pastors. This was about 2 or 3 years ago, I want to say, something like that. And pretty uniformly, the response from the pastors was, we had no idea. We had no idea what the implications of all the social media usage was. We had no idea what the kids were actually doing on their devices, and we're pretty sure that our parents don't have any idea either. They just give their children cell phones because other children have cell phones, and it's a way of being able to keep track of them and keep in touch with them, which is a good thing. And I'm sure there are plenty of kids in those families who will make the argument that the parents will buy that, we need to have cell phones because it'll help us with our schoolwork or some such thing. But again, the older generation that didn't grow up with this stuff is not always aware of the implications. And so I want you to have some of that information as a background. But again, please make sure that if you do this as a presentation, that you update the information for yourself. Some resources for you. There are new books coming out all the time on this subject. You can see even the ones that I have listed for you here are starting to get a little dated in as much as they are anywhere from just a couple of years old to up to 7 years old. Things have changed in that time. So go ahead and do your search on Amazon and see what you find. So these are some of the ones that I'm familiar with, as well as some online resources that you can look at. The one that I want to highlight for you is this one here, Common Sense Media. The reason that I want to highlight that one is because they are not only a site in which you can find reviews of movies and such, and ratings with respect to what's a family-friendly movie, what's a family-friendly game or program, or that kind of thing. But this organization also does research on media trends, and so they have some very helpful reports, media reports, and I would encourage you to go online to commonsensemedia.org and just sort of page through the different kinds of reports that they have. I just be familiar with what they have. I'm going to draw a little bit upon their work in this lecture, but I encourage you to go visit their website, see what they have, so that you know when you need the information. If you need the information, you know where you can go to find it. Now, when I say that we live in a whole new world, and a whole new digital world, really, again, there's that generational divide where people in my generation, even people younger than myself, grew up in a world that did not have cell phones, did not have personal computers, did not even have microwave ovens. The speed of technological change is a little bit dizzying with the invention of things like microchips and so on, and the ability to create tiny, tiny little devices. Things have changed so rapidly, and a lot of cultural critics would say that the change has been so fast that it's just not possible for us to keep up with all the social and moral implications that come along with introducing new technology. Now, one good example of that is simply the evolution of telephones. The world that I grew up in did have car phones in it, but almost nobody had one. You had to be a rich person to have a car phone. That was invented in 1956. All that the rest of us knew of phones were pretty much things that hang on the wall, and you had to pick up a receiver and you had to put your finger in a dial and rotate the dial in order to dial a number. And we had push button phones later on. But so in terms of mobility, a car phone was available in 1956, but you still had to use an operator. It wasn't until 1964 that you could call without an operator. And then the technology that underlies the possibility of being able to have cell phones, where cities were divided into calling cells, didn't happen until 1971. And even then, you've got cells in 1971. It takes 18 years beyond that to come up with the first practical portable phone. I remember looking at a picture of one of those. I probably should have put one of these on the slide, and it looks a little bit like an old Star Trek communicator. It's got a little flip open door on it that hides the keypad, and you can punch in the number and then talk into the part that flips down. That was in 1989. And now imagine here we're talking about what, 31 years ago. Okay, 1989 is 31 years ago, and all the things that have happened since then, right? The first smartphone was invented in 1993. It was called the Simon, and you see a picture of it on the right-hand side of the screen. It's a smartphone because it's able to do things other than just make phone calls. You had to have a stylus in order to manipulate the screen on there to touch the little icons and make them do things, but you could fax from there, you could email, you could use it as what was then known as a PDA, a personal data assistant. And of course, our cell phones now do that for us. So it was a smartphone because it was able to do a number of different things. Our first iPhone came out in 2007. And how many different iterations of the iPhone have there been since then? 2007, this is 13 years ago. So the point of a slide like this with the chronology on it is to see really how rapid the change has been. People who were born when I was born, again, didn't know about car phones in the sense of it being a common item. It was extremely rare to have any kind of a mobile phone. And now think about how many people have mobile phones. The speed in which that has happened is really quite astonishing when you think about it. Now, how many people actually own cell phones? This is data from the Pew Center in 2017. 95% of people have a cell phone in that study. 77% of people have a smartphone, and of course the prevalence is higher amongst younger people. And that's as opposed to just 6 years earlier, only 35% of people had a smartphone. So you can see how quickly this has ramped up. And again, the difference between a smartphone and just a cell phone. My mother, for example, has a cell phone. And she never had a cell phone before, but we want to make sure that instead of having to put a dedicated landline into her room at her assisted living facility, we wanted her to have a phone that she could carry around with her, that she could take with her to the dining room and that kind of thing. But it's not a smartphone. And so she only uses it as a phone. She doesn't use it to access the internet or to do anything else. And it's the smartphones that we're really concerned about. Now, again, this is 2017 data, and I would suspect that the numbers are actually higher as of 2020 when we get that data in. Now, with all these people having smartphones as well as computers, 70% of U.S. adults use social media, and there's an upward trend across time for all age groups. So young people, middle-aged people, older people, more and more across all the age groups are getting onto social media, but still across all those times, group-wise, more young people use social media than older people. So looking at the different apps, for example, you see, generally speaking, social media apps, more young people using a particular app, and even though older people are using it, it's a smaller percentage. In 2017, just over 1 in 10 people were smartphone dependent, meaning that their smartphones were the only way that they had of accessing the internet. And again, I suspect that that number is higher, that proportion is higher now. This is particularly true for younger adults and for non-white adults and for lower income adults, where for younger adults, it's a matter of the convenience of not having to log on to the computer and having your smartphone be your access. For lower income families, it's a matter of we really need to have a cell phone, but we can't afford to have both that and a desktop computer or some such thing. So as long as we have internet access through our phones, why should we pay the extra to also have separate internet access? What are the concerns that go along with this from a parent side of things, whether they're aware of it or not? The concern is, again, with smartphones rather than just cell phones, smartphones give unfettered, unsupervised access to the internet. And there are all kinds of things out there on the internet that parents don't want their children to access. But it's one thing when kids were accessing the internet only on their computers, there were parental programs and settings that you could put on things to try, and I highlight that word try, to try to keep kids from accessing those kinds of things. But, you know, the smart kid who was already a hacker in training could find ways to get into the parent's account and change the settings if they wanted to. And oftentimes the parents were completely unaware that this was happening. And, you know, now that we're talking about kids being able to be on their cell phones without the parents looking over their shoulder, you need a different way of supervising that usage, and even then you may not be able to catch everything. There was a Kaiser report in 2010 that said very few families have any rules about media use. And so it's pretty typical to just hand a smartphone to a kid because you can see the benefits of that and tell them to be careful, if you even tell them that, but not to actually monitor the usage at all. Now, what are the risks? There's a whole variety of them, from predation, which we will talk about a little bit later in this lecture and the next, and then also sleep deprivation. There is what some people have called FOMO, fear of missing out, and this is often true of teenagers with cell phones who text a lot. You don't want to be left out of a particular stream of text messages, and so some teenagers go to sleep with their phones. And if their phone buzzes in the middle of the night and there's a text, they got to wake up and catch it, just so to make sure that they're not feeling left out in some way. And that then interferes with their being able to get the sleep they need. I won't say this in this lecture, but looking at a screen with the blue light that is projected from that screen actually triggers your brain to wake up. It tells you that it's time to be awake, and so that interferes with getting back to sleep. It's not just the amount of time that you spend on the screen, it's what being on the screen does to your brain in terms of wakefulness. And so kids are waking up sleep deprived, and then there's all kinds of other things that can go along with that in terms of suffering in their schoolwork and so on, right? So the big question then is, how can parents manage their children's media behavior? And as I'll suggest to you a little bit later on, one of the questions that goes along with that should be, how can parents manage their own media behavior, which is just as important if you take seriously what we said before with respect to parental modeling. Then they need to be looking at the way that they are perhaps addicted to their devices as well. So let me just give you a sampling, and you've probably heard some of these stories, but a sampling of some of the stories that have been in the news in recent years that have suggested why digital media and devices can be dangerous. Overuse of them can be dangerous in some way. You may have heard the story from a few years ago in which a little girl used the Amazon Echo, and if you know what that is, there's a picture of it on the right-hand side of the slide. The Amazon Echo is one of those in-home assistants that you can program to order you things off of the internet, to do your music playlist, to read you a recipe, all those different kinds of things. Google has one, Amazon has one, and they can do a number of different things for you just by virtue of voice command. And so these devices are listening for their keywords, for their voice commands in order to do something. Well, there was a little girl that had one of these in her house, and she used it to order a dollhouse to play with. And if I remember correctly, I think she also ordered some candy along with it. And, you know, this stuff got delivered to the house, and the parents had no idea that she had done this. And the story made the news. And the newscasters on the evening news were telling this story and repeated one of the things that the little girl said. I think this happened in San Diego, if memory serves. Repeated one of the things that the little girl said. When the parents confronted the little girl with the dollhouse and with the candy, she just said, very matter-of-factly, "Alexa ordered me a dollhouse." And the newscasters thought that was pretty cute, and so they repeated that line on air. And when that happened in the San Diego area, people who had Amazon Echoes heard the newscaster say, "Alexa ordered me a dollhouse," and interpreted that as a command to order a dollhouse. And so in families throughout the San Diego area, an order was placed for dollhouses that they didn't want. Now, the implication of this then is the whole question with respect to, do we understand the possible implications of having a device in our household that is listening to what we say, that is listening for a particular command? Now, even if you don't have an Amazon Echo, the same thing may be true with your iPhone. If you have your iPhone set to Siri listening for the command, "Hey Siri," right? The phone is always listening. Now, if you ask Apple, if you ask Amazon, what they'll say to you is something on the order of, they're only listening for their commands. They are not listening for other things. They're not really eavesdropping on you. And for Amazon, at least, they say that there's a 30-second window in which the device is recording what you say, but then, you know, it's never more than 30 seconds at a time. That still raises privacy issues because we don't really know. Again, this is what it means to live in a whole new digital world. We don't really know what the full implications might be with respect to what happens in terms of the admissibility of evidence in court. Should a device record something that somebody else would construe as important to a criminal case, and so on. So there are all kinds of issues to having devices just automatically doing things in the background in our homes. There was a story, and this is a fairly common one, of a kid who decided to go shopping. They didn't have the Amazon Echo in their home, but they did have an iPhone. And of course, the iPhone was fingerprint protected. You needed to have mom's fingerprint on the home button in order to unlock the phone. But the kid knew that, and mom was taking a nap, and the kid didn't really think that they were doing anything bad. They just wanted to order something. They wanted to go shopping. And so while mom was sleeping, they brought the iPhone to mom and put her finger on it, unlocked the phone, and then just went on a shopping spree. There are problems related to the use of social media with stalking and shaming. I'll say more about that in terms of what's become known as cyberbullying a little bit later on. There was a story in South Korea of a young couple who had a baby, but they were so engrossed in the video game that they were playing, and ironically, a video game that involved raising a digital little pixie kind of character, feeding it and taking care of it, that they ignored their own real world child's cries, and that baby died from neglect. There are situations, we'll talk about this a little bit in part 2 of this lecture, there are situations in which people have been assaulted for what they've done in an online video game. In other words, you have defeated somebody who has spent a long time developing their character, and you did something to kill their character, and all the time and even money that the other person has invested in creating that character goes down the drain, and they find out who you are and they assault you. And then the very complicated question of role-playing games in which, for example, a game that was popular some years ago called Second Life, in which you adopt an entirely different persona online than you may have in real life. Some people who are introverted by nature suddenly become extroverts online and so forth. And one of the cases that people really wrestled over was a man who online had a different wife. He was married to somebody else online and having in cyberspace, in virtual reality, having intercourse with his internet spouse. And his real world wife was trying to figure out, is that adultery or isn't it? What does it say about their own marital relationship, and what kind of defense can he mount to say, oh, you're overthinking it, you're overreacting, and so on. All of these studies, all these stories, all of these stories are examples of how it is that our world has changed in ways that we have not been able to keep up with from an ethical point of view. Now then, there are also the kinds of concerns about the impact of technology on a number of areas of our life that are important to us. Certainly the impact of technology on information access and learning. We would not be able to do this course the way that we are doing it if we did not have the technology that we have. And so that's a good thing. But then that also raises the question as to whether or not it's impacting our learning in some other way. Is this the best way to learn? It certainly is convenient in some ways, and it helps to make sure that it's possible to do some things when they otherwise might be impossible. So in a situation in which our campus is closed down, we need the technology to keep doing what we do. But is that the best way to learn? You know, the jury is to some extent still out on that. How does technology impact the way that we communicate and connect with one another? How does it impact our relationships? Surely you have seen in a restaurant when you go out that you see a family sitting there at the restaurant and everybody is looking at a screen. Mom and dad aren't having a conversation with each other. The kids are looking at an iPad or something like that and watching a movie. Nobody's talking. Everybody is connecting with somebody else that's not actually in the room with you. And then there's the whole question of whether or not visual imagery, and I will highlight that point in just a bit, whether or not the emphasis on visual imagery is also shaping our understanding of what life is all about. When you have an Instagram account, do you then, it was kind of like the ambivalence I always had towards America's Funniest Home Videos, that a lot of the videos that win top prizes in that are of moments that probably, at least to somebody of my generation, you shouldn't be making a video of in the first place. Your wife is trying to fix the dishwasher and her hair is caught and she's in pain, and you're standing there recording this instead of helping her. What's wrong with that picture? Now, to someone like myself, I think that's reprehensible behavior. Not in the sense that somebody should be jailed for this, but how does the emphasis on visual imagery and the recording of visual imagery shape the way that we approach life? Now, this was already the case, even just with the invention of consumer available film and cameras back on what used to be called the creation of Kodak moments, so that when we think about our lives and vacations and so forth, we think about our vacations in terms of the pictures that we want to make and keep. So here are all of us having fun standing in front of some marvelous tourist attraction, right? As opposed to taking pictures of the kids fighting in the back seat. We make up our own memories out of the moments that we want to capture on video and capture in pictures. And how then does that change when we have a cell phone with us and we spend more time catching selfies and taking pictures of ourselves in places than we do actually enjoying the places or enjoying the people that we're with? Now, that distinction generationally that I've talked about before has sometimes been talked about in terms of the digital natives, that is, people who were probably born somewhere after 1990, and the digital immigrants, like myself, who were born before that era, who still remember a world in which we didn't have all of this digital technology and are still getting used to it in some ways. Now some digital immigrants adjust very quickly. They acclimate very quickly to it. Others, it takes longer, depending on how old you are and what kinds of experiences and technology you have available to you. My father, who died several years ago at the age of almost 94, wanted to learn computers, but he had a bad experience in a computer class and then swore off of them, never used them. And my mother sort of followed suit. And so she could have a smartphone, and I really do believe that she's still capable, even at her age, of learning how to manipulate one, but she never did it. And so this whole world is quite mysterious to her. And I would say that, even calling her a digital immigrant is maybe a bit of an overstatement. I'm not sure to what extent she's actually immigrated into the new world. There's a wonderful story that one of my colleagues over in theology, Cutter Calloway, tells. He says that there was a situation in which he and his daughter were watching a video on their smart TV. And there was a video that she wanted to watch, and so he needed to scroll to it. And so he was using the remote to scroll through the tiles, and his daughter was getting increasingly upset because she said, no, Daddy, scroll up. And he says, I am scrolling up. He was pushing the up button on his remote. And this went back and forth. No, Daddy, scroll up, go up, go up. I am going up. It took a while for him to figure out that even while he was pushing the up button, what that means is that the tiles on the screen are going down as you're going up. And in her perception, up meant that the tiles should be going up, but that means you need to press the down arrow on your remote. And it's just that kind of miscommunication that has become so typical of the divide between the generations in this new digital era. Now, while there are many potential areas of concern, the two that I'm going to focus on in these two lectures are social media and video games. We'll look at social media in this lecture, and we'll look at video games in part 2. And as we do that, I want to make sure, again, that we maintain an ecological perspective. It's not just a matter of, okay, so can you give parents the knowledge they need to be able to control their children's behavior? But it involves questions of remembering the importance of parental modeling. What do children see in your use of digital media? Remembering that our children are being influenced by the values and the behaviors of their peer group. remembering that our culture is going through rapid change, and the values are changing along with that, and we are internalizing those values whether we like it or not. And then there are the risks of connecting with other people, particularly with strangers online, that parents need to be aware of as well. So there are many factors that play into these questions, and we need to keep those in the back of our minds as we go along. Let me make also another qualification here, and that is, as we think about these things and as you take the opportunity to perhaps teach parents about these things, it's important to avoid what one writer has called juvenoia, or if you like, juvenile paranoia, or paranoia about what's happening with young people these days. That's kind of an old phrase that gets tossed around from generation to generation. Every adult generation seems to think that the younger generation they just don't get it, and they don't understand what the risks are, and they're doing terrible things. And from a sociological point of view, we need to qualify that some, because as you look at the statistics with respect to what are generally considered to be important social indicators of how teenagers are doing, when you look at the period in which internet use has risen, you also see declines in other important social indicators, declines in the number of teen births, decline in the number of teen suicides, declines in school violence. So it couldn't be all bad, as if the internet was just turning our kids and our teenagers into crazy people, right? The negative narrative that our children are being damaged by the rise of digital technology and digital media is sometimes compelling, because people in times of rapid social change are always made a little bit anxious by that, and we need some way of being able to make sense out of that. And so it's compelling for us to say, well, our children are being harmed by all this change, without being aware of the fact that there are actually some indicators that suggest that perhaps the opposite might be true. So the counter narrative that is important for an educator, a parent educator, to begin to contemplate is that, yes, there are risks, but we also have to point out the potential benefits and balance those things off against each other. We are certainly not going to go back to a pre-internet age. We are not going to go back to taking away everybody's digital devices. Having said that, we need to be wise about the devices that we use and how we take advantage of the new things that keep coming out. So again, if you are a parent educator, think about how both parents and children need to understand what the risks are, but also the big picture that includes the potential benefits. Be a person as an educator who advocates for wise public policy. And I'm not just talking about public policy in the political arena, but think about the kinds of agreements you might want to make within your own communities in terms of how we help each other monitor the impact of digital media, and then just don't give in to fear-mongering. There are a lot of people who would say this is terrible, and I caught my kid doing this, and so on. And you can understand why they would be upset about certain things, but that's not the same thing as saying, well, we need to get rid of this and make sure that none of our kids are doing this, and so on, right? Don't give in to fear-mongering. Just be realistic, be informed about what the risks are, and help parents figure out how to manage that. So let's talk a bit about social media, and I know that for a group like ours, we don't really need to define it, but for an academic lecture, it's important for us to at least make sure that we've got a base that we can all agree on. Social media means forms of computer-mediated electronic communication used to create online or virtual networks of people through the sharing of digital content. A lot of words in there, but pretty clear. This is exactly what we are doing with social media. And one of the implications that goes along with that is that we have what some people would call a democratization of self-expression. And that is through the curation of images and text and so forth. Now, from where I stand, for example, I grew up in a world in which if you wanted to be a published author, for example, you had to jump through a lot of hoops in order to make that happen. In order for people to read what you wrote, you had to go through traditional publishers and write up manuscripts and proposals and that kind of thing. The reality of it is anybody now can be a published author. Whether it's through a blog, whether it's through a Twitter account, whether it's through what you write on Facebook and things that you share there, or even with books, going through a publishing house that just prints whatever it is that you want to put into print. You just send them the manuscript, and yeah, sure, there are requirements that you have to go through, but now the book market is flooded with all kinds of things that don't go through the same level of scrutiny that they used to. Now, don't take that as a complaint from me. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that we have all kinds of technology at our disposal to put even just the briefest and most random of thoughts out there online for other people to digest. That's what social media has done for us. It has created for us audiences for our thoughts, our whims, our emotions, our experiences in ways that we have never had before. Who knew what you ate for dinner last night? Before this, who cared? But now you can take a picture of the wonderful dinner that you had at a restaurant and show it, and people hopefully will like it with you. Now, the early forms of social networking connected people with similar interests, but because you had to connect to that network through what was known as a modem, and if any of you remember this, I'm guessing that you don't, but if any of you remember this, this is where you had to have a separate device on your computer and you connected into a phone line, and it would have to dial into the network for you, and there would be these strange static sounds while it was trying to make the connection, and it would beep and all that, and a lot of times the connection wasn't even all that reliable. You had services like CompuServe and America Online, and eventually what they did was go beyond just connecting a network of 100 or a couple hundred people who all had some similar esoteric interest to connecting vast networks of people as the technology improved. Now, what we know as social media today was, by some historical reckonings, launched in 2003 with the app known as MySpace. And so now much of the focus is on the use of apps, particularly when we're talking about apps on our smartphones. Now, Apple likes to put together a list of their top 10 iPhone apps in terms of a number of different indicators, but one of them would be how many people in 2019 or year by year actually download that app. And so here's their top 10 going from top down to number 10. YouTube was the most downloaded iPhone app, going down the list to Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, Messenger, Gmail, Netflix, Facebook, Google Maps, and Amazon. Now notice that these are all quite different apps from each other in some ways. Some of them are social media apps, and you can see that if you're gauging popularity by downloads, then you see Instagram coming out on top, and then Snapchat, and then TikTok, and then if you want to include Messenger as a social media app, in some ways it is, and then Facebook below that. Facebook is huge, but Facebook right now is less popular in terms of downloads than Instagram or Snapchat. And TikTok is an app that is gaining in popularity. It's actually surprised some people. It was originally developed in China, and there is still a Chinese version of the app, and it has really stormed the U.S. in just a few years. There's a couple other things to notice about this list as well. And that is to look at how many of these apps are actually picture or video based. The top 4 apps, YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and then a little bit further down the list, Netflix, are all video oriented or visually oriented. Some of them, like YouTube and Netflix, are oriented towards watching videos, but then Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok are apps in which you share pictures or short videos with other people. And this is our way then of connecting with others, is using video applications. And it's also worth noting that when you look at who owns these things, that Google now owns YouTube and has for a little bit. They own YouTube, Gmail, and Google Maps, whereas Facebook owns Instagram and, of course, Facebook Messenger and Facebook itself. So out of the top 10 downloaded apps on Apple, on iPhone, 6 out of the 10 are owned by Google and Facebook. These are the organizations that are taking over the world, if you like. And then once you add Amazon to that, we're talking about corporations that have an enormous influence upon our daily lives. And again, it's worth thinking about what that influence actually looks like and whether or not we're even aware of it. So in thinking about social media, probably the most obvious place to start would be with Facebook. And here again, as I go through the description of some of these apps, I'm going to walk fairly quickly through some information and statistics just so that you have it, just so that you understand the information that I've given to you on the slides. So Facebook was launched in 2004 by Mark Zuckerberg, who has become quite a famous person in his own right because of Facebook and because of all the privacy issues and challenges that have been raised over the last several years. Zuckerberg and other students at Harvard originally created it as an app for people in colleges to connect with each other. It gradually branched out beyond the walls of Harvard to other universities, and then of course ended up taking the culture at large by storm, so that it's not tied to college and university usage at all. And some of the things that Facebook did that were innovations at the time are still quite widely used in other apps now, but they were the ones that first started these things. So the idea of friending somebody in order to make a connection with them, the idea of posting status updates, the more recent versions of Facebook over recent years, the creation of a timeline to keep track of the events in your life and create something a little bit more of a story feel. Facebook has been an open platform for other people to develop apps that would connect with that. And then that whole idea of the like button. You see something you like and you click on it, it becomes like internet currency. People want to be liked. They want to see more likes. They want to see more follows. And, you know, you've probably experienced this already, but I can tell you that I've experienced it certainly, given that I have 2 Facebook accounts and I have an Instagram account and I have a blog, that you get a lot of people who want to friend you or to like you simply on the hope that you are going to friend them or like them back, even if you don't know each other, so that they can say, look, I got more likes than you. That's part of the world that we live in now. As far as the scope of Facebook, again, just some quick stats here. There are 2.5 billion users of Facebook. This is what is known as monthly active users, or MAUs. That's the language that they use in studying these things. Monthly active users. That means 2.5 billion people use Facebook at least once a month, and 1.7 billion people use Facebook on their mobile device every day. Those are mobile daily active users. The average time per visit is 20 minutes. So now think about this for a second. 1.7 billion people on Facebook for an average of 20 minutes every day. That's a lot of Facebook time worldwide, right? The largest demographic group is between 25 to 34. Half of 18 to 24-year-old users go on Facebook as soon as they wake up. Top priority. First thing you do when you wake up in the morning is to check your Facebook account. I didn't post any of the stories here, but you are probably aware of some of the stories in which there are people who have committed a crime, but then they give themselves away on Facebook. Teenagers who break into a house and then go on the computer at that person's home and update their Facebook page and, and say, you never believe what I'm doing right now. A young person who was, I don't even remember how this happened, but got stuck in a storm drain. And the first thing she did, stuck in a storm drain, unable to get out, was instead of calling emergency services, updated her Facebook page. So this is a little bit strange to me, shall we say, right? And notice the usage there as far as the demographic, the largest demographic group being in that 25 to 34 range. That's well beyond your college years, right? There has been something of movement away from Facebook as parents and even grandparents have gotten on it. It's not cool anymore for the younger people to emphasize Facebook as their primary social media. Now, every minute of every day, there are 510,000 comments posted worldwide on Facebook. There are 293,000 status updates and 136,000 photos uploaded. 5 new Facebook profiles are created every second, and it's estimated that 83 million profiles are actually fake. So please watch out for fake friend requests. I get this kind of stuff all the time, or at least I assume that they're fake friend requests because, for example, I see somebody that I thought or I'm pretty sure that I'm already friends with and I get another friend request from them. Or you see a friend request that if you click on it and you look, that the page itself is not really very populated and they don't have very many friends and there's not information about them on there. They have a picture. They were able to get that off of Facebook themselves, right? So if I were you, I'd just be careful to not respond to those that look a little bit suspicious. Be wary of that. Again, 83 million fake profiles out there. That's the estimate. As I've suggested already, Facebook is no longer the cool social media app to be on if you're a teenager. It's far less popular than either Instagram or Snapchat. So let's talk about those two. Instagram, as you're aware, is a photo sharing app, and now it belongs to Facebook. It was launched in 2002. Facebook bought it in 2012 when there were only 30 million users. Good idea, Mark Zuckerberg, because now there are over 1 billion monthly active users and over 500 million daily active users. Over 100 million photos are uploaded every day. There are over 50 billion photos on Instagram total. Over 25 million businesses are on Instagram. This has become a big thing in recent years. This is how they do a lot of their promotion, is online. And if you ask teenagers in the United States, 73% of them will say, if a business wants to reach me, the best way to do it is through Instagram, to advertise on Instagram. And so, of course, businesses have taken them up on that. It's estimated that users will spend roughly 28 minutes a day on Instagram in 2020. Now, if you think about that for a second, and if you go back to the idea that you've got people on Facebook for 20 minutes a day, 20 minutes for an app like Facebook is really not all that much if what you're doing is you're updating your status or you're reading other people's status updates and that kind of thing. 28 minutes a day looking at other people's pictures is a long time when you think about it, right? So Instagram is the #1 app amongst for social media amongst teenagers, followed by Snapchat, a video messaging app that was released in 2011. And again, this started on a college campus, Stanford this time instead of Harvard. And the innovation here was that you could share images with each other, but those images would only be available for a short period of time, 10 seconds. That's why they call them snaps. So you could look at it and then it goes away. This was inspired by the Anthony Weiner debacle. You notice that the app was released in 2011. 2011 was the year in which Weiner, who was a New York congressman, withdrew from Congress because he had been involved in a sexting scandal. There wasn't even a word sexting prior to situations like that, where he sent some sexually suggestive pictures to a woman who was following his Twitter account. And at first, when he was brought up on charges of that, he denied it and then pleaded guilty and then voluntarily withdrew from Congress. But he didn't change his behavior. He continued to share sexually suggestive pictures on social media. And so with that then, the inventors of Snapchat said, well, what if it was possible to be able to create an app in which you could share pictures, but there wouldn't be a trail left behind, that the pictures would just go away. By their own lights, the way that they describe this is, we want an app that is meant to encourage spontaneity, that is meant to encourage less idealization. In other words, you don't have to look perfect for the picture, which is what some people do on Instagram. For example, you get a group of people together and we want to take that Kodak moment. We want to show our group having fun. And so they pose and they repose the picture, and sometimes they spend more time posing the picture than they do actually having fun with each other. Well, with Snapchat, let's have a little less of that. Let's just take the picture and show yourself for who you really are so that we can communicate the full range of human emotion. Now, I find that statement both in some ways attractive and positive, but in other ways against the background of the debacle with a congressman who had been sexting on a regular basis, that perhaps the full range of human emotion isn't always what we want to show. Usage stats: 360 million monthly active users, 218 million daily active users. The average daily active user opens the app over 20 times a day, and the average time on the app is 25 to 30 minutes a day. It is the most popular social network platform amongst teens. 90% of the users are 13 to 24 years old. So again, imagine that the majority of 13 to 24-year-olds, or let me put it the other way, the majority of the users of Snapchat are of that age group. And what would the spontaneous visual sharing of my emotional state right now look like? You are lacking a little bit of filtering there. So some pictures are going out there. You figure, well, okay, so it's only going to be there for 10 seconds. So how much harm could that be? And the popularity for an app like Snapchat goes down as you go up the age group. 3.5 billion snaps are created every day. And Snapchat has been a particularly controversial app for a couple of different reasons. One is that the app is created to have what they call screenshot prevention, so that you're posting a picture that you probably don't want to have continue on into perpetuity. And so it's only there for just a few seconds, and the other person cannot take a screenshot of it. However, it's been demonstrated that if you know what you're doing, it's possible to work around the screenshot prevention and actually get the shot, which means that it's possible for you, if you're a Snapchat user, to post an embarrassing picture, a picture that if you were really thinking about it, if your prefrontal cortex was really well engaged, you would say, it's probably not a good idea. I don't want that picture to be out there 5 years from now or 10 years from now. It's possible for somebody on the other end of the line, if they've got the technical expertise to do that, to get a screenshot of that, and then you have no control over what happens to that image and what other people are going to do with that. Some people have also argued that the images are not really gone because they are not accessible to you or presumably to anybody else, but the image still resides on Snapchat's servers. And if you are a hacker, that's the illegitimate side of things, or if you are a forensic researcher on the legitimate side of things, you're trying to build a case, a legal case, you can still get to those images. They're not really gone. So how much then do kids actually use social media? And here I'm drawing from a report from the organization that I mentioned before, Common Sense Media. They've actually done a pretty comprehensive report asking how much teenagers and what they call tweens use screens, whether we're talking about a computer, whether we're talking about a smartphone and so forth. How much screen use is going on, not including schoolwork. And certainly in the last month or so, there have been a lot of screens being used for schoolwork. And so those numbers, if we were to look at that, would be possibly different. Well, what they found was that outside of schoolwork, kids age 8 to 12, tweens, were on screens for 4 hours and 44 minutes a day, and teenagers aged 13 to 18 were on screens for 7 hours and 22 minutes a day. And so you already have questions with respect to what just plain screen usage might mean. How many kids have smartphones? They've looked at it over time. They say 19% of 8-year-olds have smartphones. I don't know about you, but I'm actually perturbed by that statistic because it's very difficult for me to understand why an 8-year-old actually needs to have a smartphone. If you look at the bullet point just below it, in 2015, and this is 4 years before this study was done, that figure was 11%. It's grown to 19%, and we can probably project that over the course of time, those numbers are going to continue to climb. Now, as you go year by year, the numbers, the percentages go up. So in their 2019 study, 19% of 8-year-olds had a smartphone. That's about 1 in 5. When you get to 9-year-olds, it's about 1 in 4. And if I remember correctly, when you get up to 10-year-olds, it's about 1 in 3. And then the curve begins to level off until you get up to 18-year-olds, and the figure is 91%. That 91%, again, 4 years previous, was only 77%. So project outwards. More and more and more kids across the age groups, all the way down to 8 years old, are going to have smartphones in their possession, with all of the other implications that go along with that. Now, in this study, they found that with that included in that 4 hours or 7 hours of screen usage, teenagers spend approximately 2 hours a day using those screens for social media. So Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook and so on. So what are the areas of concern to be addressed with respect to the use of social media? One is, do you really have privacy on the internet? What does that look like? One is cyberbullying and predation, as I've mentioned before. And then 2 more things that I'll tack on to the end of the lecture that there's really not a lot of information on, but are suggestive, and that's identity development and image management in social media, and then attachment and what one set of researchers has called peer orientation. So let's walk through this together. Concern number 1, is there really such a thing as privacy on the internet? Here's an experience that probably all of you are already familiar with, and that's targeted advertising. You know what that looks like. You're on Amazon, for example, and you look at a particular product and you're interested in buying it, but you decide not to buy it. And so you leave Amazon, you log out, and you go on to some other website, or maybe you're just checking your Facebook account or some other such thing. And as you are looking at other websites, a little pop-up occurs on the side of the screen, and it shows you the thing that you were looking at before, as if to say, well, remember this? You were interested in it before. Are you ready to buy it now? That's what we mean by targeted advertising, and that's just one species of it. What that says to us, and this is the reality of the situation, is that your online behavior, where you've gone, what sites have you gone to, how long did you stay there, what kinds of things did you look at, your online behavior is being tracked, and a user profile is being created for you. A lot of times they say, well, you have to accept cookies to use this site because it's going to make your browsing experience better. Well, what that means is something is being posted to your computer that is keeping track of your behavior so that it can target products to you that they think on the basis of your metrics you would be interested in, right? This is why you get those pop-up ads. Oh, well, you looked at this and maybe you're not ready to buy that now, but maybe you would also be interested in this, right? This is where, for example, the parents of a teenager found out that she was pregnant, even though she hadn't told them yet, because she had been online looking at diapers, at disposable diapers, and she kept getting advertisements for diapers, and her parents figured out what was going on. So your information is being tracked, and there is therefore not the same kind of privacy that we might actually want to have. Now, consumers know that this is going on. As a matter of fact, they are signing off, and oftentimes doing so without actually reading the fine print. They are signing off on user agreements as they go on to particular sites, and they generally disapprove of that. But the reality of it is that we are choosing to share information with all of these different sites, in some ways implicitly trusting that they will know the best and right things to do with it. And we do that simply because it, again, makes our browsing experience more along the lines of what we want it to be. Show me things that I'm interested in. Well, the only way that I can do that is because somebody's keeping track of what I'm looking at. I've already said this with respect to Snapchat, for example, but it's that larger question of whether or not you can really delete anything once you've put it out there online. All of your internet behavior is part of somebody's database. Theoretically speaking, a hacker or, again, a forensic researcher can get a hold of it. They can do something with it. Even if it's difficult, it is possible, and you just can't control what other people are going to do with what you put out there online. So, good rule of thumb for people, and this is an important thing to teach young people in particular, because again, we're talking about the lack of development in the executive center of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, which does not fully develop until your mid-20s, that sometimes what seems to you like a good and fun idea right this moment will not seem so good and fun an hour from now, or a day from now, or certainly 10 years from now. So a good rule of thumb is don't be naive about your privacy. Don't assume that people are going to do only good things with what you put out there. And the way that I would phrase it is, don't put anything online that you wouldn't want your mother to see. Or perhaps your grandmother, if you like. Don't put anything online that you wouldn't want your mother to see, because it's quite possible that not only your mother, but many, many other people are going to see it as well. That hopefully would give people at least a little bit more of a chance to engage their prefrontal cortex, because there are all kinds of emotional reasons for posting things that are inappropriate or sensitive, even if it's just the dopamine hit that you get from seeing another like. Okay, well, a few more likes, nothing wrong with that, but be aware of what somebody else could do with that information or with those pictures that you, in fact, will not like. Concern number 2 has to do with cyberbullying and predation, and a lot of this is just giving you the details of particular famous cases that have happened, why we even need the term cyberbullying in the first place. 2006, there was a 13-year-old girl named Megan Meyer. She was somebody who struggled with depression. She had attention deficit disorder. So, an awkward 13-year-old. Some people would say all 13-year-olds are awkward to some extent, but she had some additional struggles that she was going through. And she was online on social media, and she was friended by a 16-year-old boy named Josh Evans. And having the attention of a 16-year-old who would tell you that you're pretty and I like you and all that was very attractive to someone like her. Turns out there was no Josh Evans. It was a fake profile. It was a hoax account that was created by somebody who knew her. by a neighbor, by somebody who used to be a former friend, and her mother, which I find absolutely appalling, that her mother and this former friend formed this Josh Evans as a joke, and then it went too far because they started sending messages to her like, everybody hates you, the world would be a better place without you, and eventually what did Megan Meyer do? She committed suicide. Now, the mother was convicted of computer fraud and of computer and fraud and abuse in 2008, but never served any time for that because the decision was reversed in 2009. And the problem here is that there weren't any laws on the books for which she could be considered guilty. She hadn't really committed, by the strict sense of the law, a crime, even though she had done something that, again, for me, I consider morally reprehensible. So the case resulted in somebody trying to pass legislation, which they called the Megan Meyer Cyberbullying Prevention Act in 2009. They proposed fines, they proposed imprisonment, but it didn't pass. So if you want to keep track of cyberbullying laws in different states, I've posted a resource there for you, stopbullying.gov. This is not just about cyberbullying, but other forms of bullying as well. And there are links to what's happening in different states that can be of interest to you if you want to pursue that. Now, cyberbullying then is the term that's been coined for using the internet or other forms of electronic communication and social media to harm or harass other people, to spread rumors, to spread gossip, to spread defamation and humiliation. And again, thinking from an ecological point of view, a lot of times these cases are what I would call perfect storms of contributing factors. You see that in Megan Meyer's case. She was already struggling with mental illness herself, and then this situation occurs and those things interact with each other. Another case in 2003, Ryan Halligan, special ed student, so he's got already some struggles in that regard. He committed suicide in 2003 for a similar situation as Megan Meyer's. Somebody started an online rumor that he was gay, and then a popular girl led him to believe that she was really his friend so that he would say things without filters, that he would reveal embarrassing information about himself, and then she would take that information and spread it online to humiliate him further. And again, no criminal charges were filed, even though he committed suicide, because there was no applicable law. And so the risks are very, very real as far as, especially with kids that don't have the proper filters to determine what is and what is not appropriate to put online, because there are other people who will take advantage of that. And then just briefly, a story that I've become aware of, in which a young woman, a teenager, posted on her Facebook page her opinion about a conflict that was happening between a couple of other friends, and she was, quite direct and vocal about what she said, and then ran into one of these other people at a party, and a fist fight ensued, and she actually got her face broken in that context. So even online conflict can spill over into real life and result in physical injury. Now, this notion of predation then, and this is something that those people who are working in the area of trying to prevent human trafficking are very keen to point out. You need to recognize that pedophiles network with each other and exchange photos with each other on apps like Facebook. Even though there's a policy against it, they're not supposed to do that. They do it anyway. In 2011, the FBI estimated that 500,000 pedophiles go online every day, and they go to the spots, they go to the places where children and teenagers go. They pose as somebody else, and they then try to friend them. Hey, you're really pretty, you're really attractive, or some such thing, and try to get, again, people who are a little insecure about themselves to drink in the praise that they're getting from these false profiles, and then take the personal information and share that on social media. Oftentimes the way that it goes is they start asking for more and more private information, and they continue to praise them as much as possible and tell them how good looking they are until they have enough trust from the kid that the kid is actually willing to share sexually explicit pictures with them. And then what the pedophile does is, after they get those pictures, they begin to collect them. They begin to trade them with other pedophiles online, and then they ask to meet with them. And if the child refuses, the kid may be threatened with either exposure, I'm going to put all your stuff out there online for everybody to see, or their family is threatened with violence. You better do what I say or bad things are going to happen. And so you have a household in which a child is experiencing this tremendous amount of stress, being roped into doing things that they don't want to do anymore, but they feel like they can't tell anybody about it because if they do, terrible things are going to happen. Now, similar strategies. This is the exact same kind of thing that happens when you actually want to recruit a child to traffic them. You better do what I say, or else there are going to be dire consequences, and you don't want that. So the FBI has a list of things that would be helpful for parents to know, even as frightening as it may be. Here are the ways in which you can begin to suspect that your child is being groomed for trafficking. Your kid spends a lot of time online, especially at night when they think that you don't see. You discover that they have pornography on their computer. They begin receiving calls from strangers, or they begin making calls to numbers that you don't recognize. And this presumes that a parent is monitoring cell phone usage, which in and of itself is not all that common. That's one of the things that parents can do, is to say, okay, so if I'm going to give you a cell phone, then I reserve the right to just on any day, at any time, to look at what you're doing on your phone. And that helps the kids to keep their noses clean. So this assumes that you're monitoring that activity. You see that they're making calls to numbers that you don't recognize, that could be a sign. They're receiving mail or gifts or packages from strangers. You walk into the room and they automatically turn off the monitor, or they switch screens and you catch them doing that. It's because there's something they don't want you to see, or they become withdrawn because, again, they're going through this crisis situation and they don't know how to handle it and they don't know how to reach out. It's important for parents to know this kind of thing is illegal, whereas the cyberbullying may not have specific laws that govern that. Child exploitation, even the transmission of pornographic images, is a federal crime, and leads can be reported through the number that I've given to you there on the screen, the cyber tip line. And then finally, a couple of concerns that can be just thought about. They've been raised, but I'm not aware of a great deal of research on this. The question of identity development and image management. Certainly, ever since people have started researching the development of identity in adolescence, people have recognized that this is a tumultuous time. People have become teenagers become more aware of how other people are looking at them, and sometimes they are a little hypersensitive to that. What's the impression that I'm giving? How are people looking at me? What are they thinking about me? In a way that was not true when they were younger. And so those concerns over their identity then play into the way that they feel that they need to manage their online image through social media. And sometimes even the parents get involved in that. You are probably aware of cases in which a teenager has an online Facebook account or some such thing, and it's the mother of the teenage girl. I'm thinking of one case in particular. It's the mother of the teenage girl who is posting all the status updates and putting up fun pictures because she wants her daughter to have a reputation for having a fun and interesting life, and their family is fun and interesting and that kind of thing. That's spilling over in inappropriate ways where the teenager now has to worry not just about what other people think, but she has to worry at another level of what mom thinks about how she's managing her own image. And so the questions of image management become particularly acute in a way that they never have been prior to the advent of social media. And there are, in a related fashion, studies of what's called Facebook envy and depression, where because what we tend to post on our Facebook pages are, again, the more Kodak moments, the more impressive kinds of things. Look how much fun I'm having. Look how interesting my life is. Look how I have all these different things to celebrate. And even though we know that, some studies would suggest that, for example, college students who spend more time on Facebook looking at other people's profiles are more prone to depression because their own life looks rather bland and uninteresting by comparison to what they see on other people's Facebook pages. And there is also then what has been called, and I've mentioned this before, FOMO, fear of missing out, when we're talking about, I'm not a popular person, or other people doing fun things without me, and so on. Social media can exacerbate those kinds of fears. Very briefly then, concern number 4, which was raised by a couple of researchers who talk about attachment and peer orientation. It's already the case, again, with people who have studied adolescence, that we know that as children grow up, as they go into their adolescent years, they tend to turn more and more away from their parents, and they begin to form attachments with their peer group. But what these researchers are beginning to raise a question about is, so to what extent, especially if we're talking about a child who does not have a secure attachment to their own parents, do they expect to find or hope to find secure attachments in their peer group? When, as adolescents, peer groups are notoriously fickle. And what kinds of psychological stress and potentially damage are they going to experience by hoping that they're going to have these more secure relationships with teenagers who may dump them at any second? So they're concerned about particularly how all of this peer orientation through social media in adolescence is going to be complicated by a lack of secure attachment in childhood. So stay tuned on that one. I'm sure that there will be more research on that as time goes on. So all of that then about social media. What we're going to talk about next in part 2 of this lecture is the implications of the rise of video gaming and the nature of how video gaming has changed over the years.